Right. I like that you kind of have this unequivocal call that we need to resurrect the anti-war movement in this country. I mean, I couldn't agree more, Danny, as an internationalist, as someone whose empathy extends beyond the borders of my country and who understands this violence that's externalized by my government. It's kind of confusing to me that other people don't really acknowledge this. Let's start by breaking down some of these myths, that your book deconstructs, that underpin American exceptionalism and American innocence. I guess starting with the greatest one that we're living in right now, which is the George Bush mantra, why do they hate us? Going to William Bloom, they hate us because we killed them. There seems to be this huge disconnect today. 19 years after this perpetual war on terror was launched, trillions of dollars squandered, countries destabilized, millions of lives lost or forever destroyed. Terrorism has been compounded exponentially as a result of this. So can you talk about this foundational myth of the war on terror and how U.S. policy has played the greatest role in terrorism?
Of course, it's so critical, even as the war on terror seems to be a more sidelined narrative, that there has been this interesting way that this policy has lost legitimacy, especially in the wake of Russiagate. But it still really forms the root of all U.S. policies. And now there's just a lot of silence about it. So the real logic of the war on terror was a racial logic. It was a racist logic. It was a logic of white terror. It was the idea that the empire, the U.S. empire, was under attack itself, which is ridiculous because there have been many scholars who have shown that actually the U.S., as it built its empire over the course of the centuries, has actually never been under threat from any world power, whether we talk about the Cold War or we talk about before then. There hasn't really been a time in U.S. history, World War II especially, being one of the most mythologized wars in the history of all wars. So the war on terror created this fear of the other, this fear of Arabs, this fear of people who practice the Islamic faith. The war on terror really stoked the flames of repression. What we saw was the intensification of domestic repression. We saw the massive surveillance state that was built to collect all of our data through the intelligence apparatus, and as well as a heightened police state where not only were Black people and people of color terrorized to an even greater degree, and people who practice Islam, Muslims, they were followed, especially in New York City, hundreds in prison. And to this day, there is this Black identity extremist program that's all about fighting the terrorism, so-called terrorism of Black activists. And so the war on terror shaped the domestic infrastructure of the police state, as well as justified the massive expansion of the war machine abroad, not only the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, but former General Wesley Clark of NATO showed us that actually there were 7 countries on the hit list, and we've seen all 7 of those nations, Somalia, Iran, Syria, Libya, and the rest, come under the gun of U.S. imperial invasion, proxy wars, etc. And so the war on terror has been so instrumental because that fear of the other that George W. Bush invoked, and that really Barack Obama did the same thing, this fear of the other helped obfuscate both of those developments. But what's really ironic about it, and we talk about this a little bit in the book, is that, in fact, the U.S. had been stoking terrorism in that region for decades. And to this day, whether we're talking about the destruction of Libya and the war again, ongoing war against Syria, these same forces, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic fighting group, the Jabhat al-Nusra, we can go down the line of all the so-called Al-Qaeda affiliates that exist in the region at large, in the Middle East, North Africa, and the U.S.'s influence, its stamp, its involvement is very clear. What's interesting about the narrative of the war on terror is that the fear of the other was actually something that the U.S. was materializing abroad and using those forces, those so-called terrorist forces, to not only label an entire people criminal, but then to criminalize the entire population. We saw the Obama administration pass the 2012 NDAA, where he said that the military had the right to arrest and detain citizens in the United States without any trial and without any accusation, without any charge. So this war on terror has become so dangerous. It's become such a valuable narrative and it's such a valuable tool in this American exceptionalist ideology for ensuring that the majority of people in the United States will sign on to wars or will ignore them because there is such a loud and cacophonous drive to dehumanize large sections of the world, really, for the aims of U.S. imperialism.